Welcome to another episode of Inspire People, Impact Lives. I'm your host, Josh Kosnick, Managing Partner here at Northwestern Mutual Madison. And today we have a special guest, Chad McGehee, Director of Meditation Training and founder of McGehee Meditation Consulting. So interestingly enough, as you hear this, I have a sarcastic response to his title, and then it's like, oh, cool, you're a director of meditation. And it's like, oh, cool, you're a director of meditation. And there's a lot more behind that title. I want to get into it. As you may know, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, if I could get that out. And so we're excited to have Chad here today, share some of his insights on mental health beyond just meditation, beyond his title. So Chad, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. It's awesome to be here.
Well, why don't you give us a little bit about your background, yourself, your family, before we jump into things?
Sure. Yeah. So live in Madison now with my partner, Aaron, and our son, Finn, and really love, being in town. Growing up, I was, across the border in Illinois.
Me too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Small town, Illinois.
I say you said that sheepishly because I know we're in enemy territory.
Yeah.
You're safe.
Okay. Good to know. You never know around these parts, like where that can get you into trouble or not. So I grew up in Illinois in a small town and, like a great upbringing. Like I had, proud son of Mike and Gail McGehee who, raised me and, taught me some of those core things that, made me who I am today.
Nice. What small town?
Sycamore, Illinois.
Okay. I was born in Ottawa, Illinois, another small town on the river.
Yep.
But didn't really live there. That's where my parents grew up. And then we lived in Peoria and Champaign. So I moved up here in 8th grade. So my loyalties were tied to Chicago sports before moving up here. But now a huge Badger fan. We'll never convert to the Packers. But
we have that in common.
Yeah.
I married a woman from Green Bay. So all of the skills of self-regulation that come with mindfulness and meditation training are required very much in our household.
So especially on Sundays, right?
Absolutely.
That's good. So tell us a bit about the work going on at UW and with Healthy Minds.
Sure. So, so there's this group on campus called Center for Healthy Minds, founded by neuroscientist Richie Davidson. And he's a really interesting person. And so Richie got his PhD from Harvard and then got faculty here at Wisconsin and was studying affective neuroscience, or the science of emotions. Mm-hmm. But he had been a meditator for a long time and was experiencing the benefits of meditation. And he wanted to study meditation scientifically. And at the time, his advisors and colleagues told him, don't do that. That'll wreck your scientific career. Meditation is not the stuff of serious...
Because it's foo-foo stuff.
Yeah, it's not the stuff of serious scientific study. Unfortunately, he didn't listen. And in some ways, single-handedly went on to create this field that we now call contemplative neuroscience, or the science of training the mind. So now the Center for Healthy Minds has 14 PhD-level scientists kind of all working around this central question of what constitutes a healthy mind. So I joined that group 7 years ago as a meditation teacher. And my job was kind of create the trainings and deliver the trainings to various populations, kids, teachers, law enforcement officers, corporate groups, athletes, and then the scientists would kind of measure the impacts of the trainings that we were doing. And we'll get more into the UW athletics work, but that work that we're doing in the athletics department with meditation training is still connected to the ongoing research, so we can understand empirically the impacts of what we're doing.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it's really interesting to me that you have so much. I think, it's gotten better over the years, the view on meditation, right? But even myself, over the years growing up in sports, playing football, whitewater, different things that have done like the meditation, and then also being ADD myself, like it was really hard for me to accept meditation being a good thing, right?
Totally. I mean, I jokingly say this at times, but honestly, when I show up and say I'm a meditation teacher, I think people expect robes, tie-dye. They're getting ready for a
Buddhist
bunch of chanting.
Buddhist monk is like what, like the image.
That's
right?
the connotation that comes to mind. Like what they don't think about is, training at Camp Randall so that you have the qualities of poise and concentration in intense moments. They don't think about law enforcement officers doing this. They don't think about this happening to impact performance. So we're really kind of shifting out of kind of old stereotypes, but also we're building off of thousands of years of traditions on what it takes to train the mind. There's a lot of wisdom, both from the traditional perspectives and also scientifically on how to do this.
Right. And you think about characteristics of, say, a Buddhist monk. By the way, that big water is yours as well. I don't remember if I told you that. You don't just have to have the shot glass. So, but you think about Buddhist monks, and just like one of the characteristics that first comes to mind is like tranquility.
Sure.
Right. So, or just peacefulness.
Yeah.
That if you've ever had any conversations with a Buddhist monk or anyone that practices meditation like that, you get this sense of calm.
Yep.
That you don't necessarily get in conversations with many other, probably most other people.
Yep.
Right. So if you think about that and what they've practiced, like, it's really interesting that there would be such a negative connotation, just stereotypically, with it. It is
really interesting, and to me it's kind of surprising that it's taken this long to kind of have this entryway into elite performers and sport, but it's obviously really exciting that it's there. But to your point on, whether we're around, somebody who's practiced meditation for a long time, like a monk, or even after somebody does like a practice, even a short practice, 3 minutes, 4 minutes of practice, the most common response after we do a practice, I'll say, what did you notice? People will say they were calm or they were relaxed, right? Which is a wonderful outcome, mm-hmm. right? But what do we call calm and relaxed in a high intensity moment? We call it poise, right?
Or the zone.
And for most athletes or for most high performers, whether it's in business or wherever in their life, that experience is random. It's great when it's there, it's a bummer when it's not. But they don't know how to train to experience it more often. So when we start to do these in these high performing environments and people start to see, oh, these are kind of the factors that at play that support me kind of having that level of concentration and focus and resilience, and I can actually train for those, then people get really excited really quickly. And to this point, the work that we were doing with athletes really started with a group of retired NFL guys. And with that group, it was a pilot in every way, because I didn't know if we could do a rigorous meditation training, would they see it as something that made sense to them and was a sport to them, or would they see it as a bunch of frou-frou, woo-woo, not appropriate for me, I played in the league sort of thing.
I'm mentally tough without this, yeah.
And like the last thing you're going to do is get me to think about what's going on in my own mind and my own body, mm-hmm. right? Like there's a lot of stigma, there's a lot of training to not do that for many of us culturally, especially in high performing environments. Like I
resonate with that.
It's all outcome oriented, right? Like I don't care what's going on for you internally. All I care about is your production. Yet there's a lot of lack of wisdom in that, because like what's going to produce high performing results over time? It's what's going on for people, right? It's not just the external supports, but it's internally in their own thoughts, emotions, their body. So how can we support those things? So these retired NFL guys saw that. They experienced it. They had the benefits of it for themselves, not only in whatever roles they had in now that they were out of the league, as dad, as business people, whatever they were doing. Some of them were still on staff at Wisconsin. And they said, hey, we think this could benefit some of our current teams. Yeah. So then we started a pilot with a few teams where there were internal champions who had that first person experience of the practice. They had, mindfulness meditation isn't just a bunch of ideas. Like just by like reading a book about mindfulness or meditation and hoping it impacts you would be like going to a restaurant, eating the menu, hoping for nourishment.
Please don't do that. There's a lot of germs on menus.
It wouldn't work, right? So you actually have to practice. You have to feel it in your bones. It's the embodied experience of it that makes all the difference. So then these guys went through the training, and they were in different positions in the athletic department. One was head strength coach for football. And so we said, hey, he controlled time. So we started to do some stuff with that team. Another coach had been on the Chicago Bulls staff in the 90s when Phil Jackson was doing this stuff, when he brought in George Mumford. And so their strength coach, he said, all right, let's start to pilot these things. So those internal people who get it, who know what it feels like, but not just the idea of it, is where it started to take root. And then from there is just kind of taken off.
I think so you just said a bunch of great stuff there, but one thing that stuck out to me, because we were talking about the pandemic earlier, the beginning of the pandemic, the first thing you remember is The Last Dance for me. Mm-hmm. Besides all the business stuff getting shut down, all the emotion stuff like that. Yeah. Like when I was on, because I don't watch much TV, mm-hmm. I was so excited for The Last Dance. Because I was, growing up a Chicago Bulls fan like you, and just that was our era. Like it was, in my opinion, basketball at its finest, right? But one of the things they didn't cover a ton was they did, Phil Jackson some, but they didn't really get into how the Zen leader became the Zen leader.
Yeah.
They spent one episode on it, and they talked mostly, from my remembrance of it, about how he was just a great orchestrator and kind of a quirky guy, but he's so well read, and some of the wellness things he was doing with essentially from Buddhist monk training to bring that mindfulness to the players. I mean, you just have these hyper competitive athletes, and you're working with, so those are professionals being paid to do it. You're working with college athletes who have just an immense pressure on them. Like, I was a D3 athlete, and I remember the nerves that came with that, but they're nothing compared to a D1 athlete that's on scholarship, that's trying to pass their classes, trying to satisfy all these different things, and the schedule for football is just insane. And basketball and some others as well, but then some other sports aren't as rigorous as football, but like a football with a highly, how I want to say, televised, and just all eyes on these players and the pressure on 18 to 22-year-old kids. Like, how many universities are doing this?
Yeah, so we at Wisconsin are the only university in the nation that has a full-time dedicated person to meditation training. It is happening at other universities where, like colleagues, like folks in kind of clinical sports psychology roles, can kind of offer the training as part of the suite of things that they offer. But in terms of like somebody who this is their dedicated, experience and expertise in this area, so far we're the only school in the country that's offering it.
Wow, that's awesome. I think Wisconsin needs to do a better job of marketing some of these things. Just, not only present, but you talked about your predecessor and the uniqueness that came to that. I think I heard recently that it was either the first stem cell transplant or something of that nature was performed at UW as well. And it's like, that should be like front and center marketing.
Right. Yeah, I think we live in kind of an amazing place, and in many ways I don't even understand like how resource rich we are. Wisconsin Athletics was also the first university athletic department in the country to hire a full-time diversity, equity, and inclusion leader. Right. So there's so many things that are kind of at the front edge. So, honestly, it's one of the things that, the work that I'm doing, I don't know if it would have been possible to do this at every major university in the country. Like, there's some kind of causes and conditions that are at play here that allowed it to be, including having a place like the Center for Healthy Minds, this world-leading research institution, including having leadership in the athletic department that understands the value of some of this sort of training and understands that, yes, this can impact our student athletes and their performance, in all sorts of ways, and we can get into some of the examples of how that shows up, but it can also support them on the student part of it, right? Like, they're student athletes, and Wisconsin takes that very seriously. So how does this show up so they can be high performers academically, and how can it show up for them to be people, right? Like especially if we think about this past year and everything that's happened and the reckoning our country is having with 400 years of systemic racism. Like, this impacts all of us. It impacts these student athletes. So are we giving them the resources to have the stability, the okayness, training their minds to stay in it through all of that? Right. Do we just hope for it, or do we actually train for it? Yeah. So it's exciting to be at a place that supports all of this.
So as you think about the training for it, what over the last year, and this is probably simplifying so much of your work, so I apologize for that, but what do you think was the most helpful? As you just spoke of, we got just, tension on race flaring at the same time we have a hopefully once in a generation pandemic, right? So at the same time you have this crux going on, and oh, by the way, you're going to do virtual learning. Yeah. Your lives are going to be turned upside down. Or we're going to deliver food to the dorms for you. You don't get to get out and socialize and do all those normal things that you're used to doing. On top of all this, like, what? Maybe speak to that and then say because I always like to give practical feedback and giveaways to the audience as well. Yeah. So maybe speak to what I just spoke of there, because it was such a high tension. And by the way, everybody, he started April last year, so right at the beginning of the pandemic. So hey, welcome to the fire. So talk a little bit about that, and then maybe some practical takeaways.
Yeah. So I've been thinking recently, in sport, in business, in life, we talk all the time about being kind of comfortable in the uncomfortable. And actually, I think there's a certain misunderstanding in that phrase. I think like saying to be comfortable in the uncomfortable is kind of like saying you should be dry or try to stay dry when you're wet. Well, you're wet. Like, that's the reality of things. Yeah. Like, you're uncomfortable. That's the reality of things. So I don't think the goal should be to be comfortable in the uncomfortable. I think the goal should be to have stability in the uncomfortable. So what happens when we have that stability when things are changing all around us? What happens when we have stability when there's 1,000 things going on, most of which we don't control? Like, what happens when the world shuts down because of a global pandemic and where people are rioting in the streets justly in many ways over inequities in this country? Like, are we going to be comfortable in that? I sure as heck, monitoring my language, hope not, right? Because that's an uncomfortable situation. Right. But can we be stable in the midst of that? So one of the metaphors we use, and this comes from George Mumford, talking about Last Dance, and he was the guy that Phil brought in to do some of the teaching, talks about being in the eye of the hurricane. That in any given moment, we have the capacity to be stable, present, rooted, a sense of okayness, even while conditions are spinning all around us. And that eye of the hurricane, that stability, that's mindfulness. And we've all experienced it. We know what it feels like. But again, for many of us, it feels random. It's great when it's there. It's a bummer when it's not. Well, we're training to experience it so that it's not so random. So what does that look like? There's all sorts of kind of applied ways that this shows up. But I'm thinking of a recent example. We're talking about, student athletes and these high intensity moments and what are their experiences. And, in general, I try not to share student athletes' experiences unless they've shared them themselves, right? But one of the student athletes, Molly Haggerty, on the volleyball team, which of course our volleyball team's amazing, right? Like back-to-back Final Fours, like Coach Sheffield's built an amazing program, and I've been very fortunate to be able to support that team over the past couple of years.
And most of them are coming back, so we're going to run it back.
Yep, totally. National championship, here we come. Let's rock and roll. So in their recent tournament run, in the games versus Florida, they were down. Things got a little sideways, and there was a timeout where Molly Haggerty, leader of the team, spoke to the team, and then they came out, and ended up like turning the corner and won the match. And in the post game, they asked her, what did you say? And what she told the team, and this is something we talk about all the time in our training, is be where your feet are. Mm-hmm. Like right now, I invite you, Josh, I invite everybody listening, feel the sensations that are happening in your feet. Feel the weight, the pressure, the immediacy that's happening. By connecting to the immediacy of the sensations, it gets us out of the thinking mind, gets us out of worrying about the future, worrying about the past, and it connects our minds and bodies right here in this moment. So be where your feet are is a line that I learned from Coach Tom Coughlin, right? Former head coach, front office guy in the NFL. Be where your feet are. What we're doing is we're training to make that accessible. And we can do that anywhere, right? Mm-hmm. We can do that, in the conference room. Athletes can do it on the field of competition. We can do it at home. We can do it wherever we want. It's just as simple as taking a moment to train your mind to be stable, present, have that eye of the hurricane so that we can bring that stability to what may be very uncomfortable in our external world.
It's your attention and focus, right?
Totally.
So have you read Positive Intelligence by Dr. Shazad Shamim?
Yeah, a while ago, yeah.
I found that book to be really powerful. And one of my business coaches, we took our whole leadership team, our network office leadership team through some of his coaching and work. Mm-hmm. And just as you talked about that, it was like feel your feet underneath you, being present. Rub two fingertips together and feel each groove on your fingerprints. Yeah. Like your breath as it goes in and out of your nostrils. Feel the slightly different temperature as it goes in, as it goes out. So like some of those things are directing really simply and quickly your attention to the present tense. Yeah,
we talk about those as in meditation training as anchors, that they're always available to us. And by choosing to bring our attention to it, then it wakes up these capacities of stability, of focus, right? Of kind of being here for what's happening. There's an amazing study that was done a few years ago at Harvard where they sent people text messages. And the first text message was, what are you doing? Second text message was, what are you paying attention to? So what's your guess? Like what percentage of time, and this has been replicated many times, so it's a very consistent finding, like kind of across American population samples, but what percentage of time do you think most people are paying attention to what they're doing? I won't ask you what time you're paying attention to what you're doing, but.
I mean, you could, I'm an open book, but now, are they answering honestly, or are we saying this is the actual
We
study?
think it's like, because it's been replicated so many times, we think this is like a pretty solid finding. It's
I would
accurate.
say they're paying attention, they're admitting to paying attention probably 50% of the time, and their actual attention is probably 25% of the time, would be my guess.
Yeah, so you're spot on. Like what we found is people are roughly paying attention 47% of the time, 50% of the time, right? So think about the implications of that, right? That means 50% of the time we're missing what's happening in front of us, right? And we all know what that feels like. How many times have you been reading something and you get to the end of the page and you have absolutely no idea what you read?
Yeah.
Or you're talking to somebody and completely lost track, or the other way around, that other person's not with you. Like in our personal lives, right? Like we're busy thinking about what happened earlier at the office and we're not present for this moment. Or an athlete, how many times do we say things in sport like one play at a time, one rep at a time, right? One possession at a time. And how many times do we train for that?
All the time.
So we actually have to take the time to train these muscles. And what we know neuroscientifically is that neurons that fire together wire together. So if we don't take the time to train our brains for these qualities of focus and attention, and we live in a time where our attention is pulled in so many different directions, we think about with modern technology and all of these pieces. If we don't take the time to train for it, by default, we're training our mind to be distracted. So we have to take the time to train our mind to be focused and attentive and with the task at hand.
It's like green and growing or ripe and rotting. There is no neutral. Mm-hmm. So you're saying if we're training our mind to do positively, the neurons are going to wire to do positively. But by default, if we're not training our minds to do positive things, they're automatically doing negative things, which are training our neurons to go the negative way.
Yeah, it's all built on this idea that I'm sure you've come across, in your various readings of neuroplasticity.
Yep.
Right? Yep. This is just the truth of how human brains work. They're learning machines. And so who's in charge of that process?
We are.
And a lot of times we're not.
Right.
It just
we
circumstances.
Say we should be.
We can be. Yeah. There's the opportunity is there. And that's where I find this work so hopeful and empowering, right? It says we have the opportunity to train our minds for qualities that are important to us. Even think about, in a lot of the positive psychology literature, I'm sure you've come across this idea of the negativity bias. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because humans are hardwired to notice threats. And from an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense, right?
The amygdala magnifying by 200 times or whatever it is.
Yeah, because we need to know, is that rustling in the bushes, a tiger? Or is it just the wind? We need to discern that really quickly if we want to pass on our genes. But that kind of hardwired negativity bias, searching for threat, is still with us. And we don't live in those environments anymore. So if we don't consciously train the mind to notice some of the good things that are happening, then our mind is always going to go back to noticing the challenging things that are happening.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-acceptance, and how it ties into this work. Because I imagine especially now, let's focus on that. I got a secondary question because I think that's a big one as it is.
Sure. That's a huge one. So, I think they're deeply intertwined. So when folks start to engage in mindfulness and meditation training, the terrain that we start to cover right away, I think about it as kind of four main areas. In any given moment, we're engaged in some behavior. We're doing something, whether it's, listening or writing or whatever we're doing something. At any given moment, there's always some emotion that may be there, right? Happy, sad, excited, curious, motivated, insecure, right? These are all just normal human emotions that we all experience. Next area are senses. There's always, where seeing is happening, listening is happening, right? Sensations throughout the body are happening. And then the fourth is thoughts. Our mind produces thoughts all the time. The thoughts may be about the future, maybe about the past, some may be useful, some may not be useful. So these four areas I think about is, behaviors, emotions, senses, and thoughts. The acronym comes together nicely as BEST. If we want to be at our best, we need to first be aware of what's happening in all of those categories. Because if we're not aware of it, it's driving a lot of what's happening in our life. So first we need to become aware of it. That's the mindfulness. That's aware of what's happening in our mind and body as it's happening. And then the second is having the skills to be able to work with it as it's happening. There's no, probably the biggest myth and misconception about mindfulness and meditation is people will say I can't empty my mind. I can't stop thinking. And that response, frankly makes me mad at the person who taught that person how to meditate, because it's impossible to stop your mind from thinking.
Right.
The goal is not to empty your mind, right? Like the mind produces thoughts like the lungs breathe. It's just what it does. The question is, do we have the space to see it as it's happening and then choose, is this one that's helpful for me? Is this going to move me in the direction of the core values that are important to me, the goals that I have set out for me, or is it not? So I think there's a lot when we talk about like self-awareness and self-regulation and self-acceptance, there's a certain amount of, do we have the skills to know what's happening in the terrain of our own experience, and accepting that some of it's just being a human.
Yeah.
This stuff happens. Like mind wandering's fine, right? It's not a problem. Like experiencing, challenging emotions is not a problem. Like, in fact, it's probably a sign of health. Right?
Okay, let's dig in there then, because I like that. So the analogy I always like to draw that I was taught, because I love neuroscience. Like of all this geeky stuff that I would actually geek out on, like I actually love that. So I was taught like to think of thoughts like clouds passing through the sky, right?
Yeah.
And that there's, say, I see the number from 40 to 70,000 thoughts that a human has on any given day.
Yeah.
Could be different than that, and 90% of them are repeated from yesterday, right? So now that you've got a person that's facing this challenge and they're attaching themselves to a negative thought, and it's a recurring negative thought, how are you working to get them out of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a thought comes up, right? And say it's like one of those like repetitive, recurring thoughts, right? One that's like common for a lot of us is some version of, I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
Right. Imposter syndrome, like things like that, right? That like come up. And so one of the techniques we can use to do that is, the thought comes up and you can almost imagine like that thought having a tether, and tether it back into your body. Like, where do you feel that in your body? Is it like a tightness in the chest? Is it, like in the forehead? And then track it, what's happening in the body. The body, again, remember, sensations in the body are happening in the present moment, the immediacy of it, right? So what that tends to do is loosen the intensity of our relationship with that thought, creates a little bit of space between that thought, right? So then we can see it, there's the sensation that's connected to it, there's the thought, all of a sudden it's just a thought that's happening. Without that space, it's the whole story. Yeah. It's reality,
You're
right?
Consumed by it.
Totally consumed by it. And then the mind just recruits all these resources to find all the evidence to prove why we are in fact an imposter, or why we are in fact good enough. And it just like creates this whole story. So by giving it that little bit of space, then we give ourselves the opportunity to see it more clearly, right? Like, see if I can remember this correctly. Maybe you know it, the Viktor Frankl quote of, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom to choose our response.
Yeah.
Like,
I think you nailed it.
I think I did. Like that's where we're working, right? And what we're doing is we're training to create that space more often. And again, it's inherent human capacity. Like, we have it. We're just kind of, recognizing it. And by recognizing it, it tends to show up more and more often. So that in a high intensity moment, right? We think about like in sport, if a quarterback comes to the line of scrimmage and it's, 80 yards to go, like minute 50 on the clock, down by 6, is that the time to be thinking like, oh shit, right? Like I got, this is where the, situation of the game, or like last time I was in this situation, the edge rusher came around and smoked me. No, that's the opportunity to feel your feet on the floor, right? On the field, feel the breath come in and out, right? Plays in, and then, read the defense, what are the safeties doing, and then just go execute. So it's kind of giving that space and training for that space so they can show up in these high intensity moments.
That's great. That's great. And then let's say they give them that space. Let's talk about the person that's consumed by this "I'm not good enough" thought.
Yeah.
Because I think you're right. Like, that's pretty popular.
Yep.
Right. No matter where anyone's at in life, that one will come up.
Yep.
It's come up for me. It's come up for, I'm sure, anyone at any given time.
Yep. Absolutely.
So they've given it space. It comes back tomorrow.
Yeah. So there's a certain amount of kind of like various things can happen there, right? That thought has some utility probably, right? It may point out the areas where we need to improve, right? Because all of us have areas we need to improve, right. Whether it's as an athlete, or in business, right? Like there's, certain aspects of, maybe somebody feels like really good, like reaching out to new clients, like no problem. They're really good at that, right? But maybe there's an area where they like struggle kind of interpersonally with folks internally on the team, right? So that thought may illuminate, oh, hey, this is an area where it's not that I'm not good enough, but it's showing me an area where I need to improve, right? So we need to have the stability or the mindfulness to be able to, what is this thought trying to show me, right? And learn from it. Where we tend to get in trouble is when it just kind of repeats itself endlessly and we believe it endlessly, right? Yeah. So at a certain point, it starts to be like, kind of like almost like an old friend. Oh yeah, that thought's back. Oh yeah, there it is again. Yep. Just like clockwork, right? It just comes up.
Have you found power in like labeling that personality or that thought or anything like that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it really, it sounds like maybe you have too, like it really gives like that space, right? Yeah. And kind of depersonalizes it, right? It's just like in the same way to your metaphor of like, we can watch, thoughts come by like clouds in the sky. This is just kind of like the weather of our minds, the weather of our experience. Like we can be pissed off that it's like a rainy day, but like that doesn't make any sense, right? Like in the same way that we can't control most of the thoughts that are coming through our mind. We tend to take them also personally, but they're not personal. They're just like this momentum from our experience, right?
Well, that's such a good distinction because we take them personally and we think we can control them.
Totally. And we get ourselves in a lot of trouble right there.
Yeah.
We get in a lot of trouble trying to control so many things that we can't control. Right. So I think there's a lot of power that comes. We're talking about kind of control the controllables, this that we use, like how do we find this stability like in the midst of difficult situations? So I think a lot of power actually comes when we start to let go of all the things we can't control. Right. Even as I say that, my shoulders loosen, right? Like my breath gets a little bit deeper, right? Like start to notice some new things. It's so easy to get wrapped up in trying to control all these things. And when we stop and realize, wow, there's so many things I can't control, then we can see more clearly the things that we actually have influence over. And then when we go impact those things, well, then dominoes start to fall. So that discernment is really important.
Yeah, that's really good. I just noticed myself take a deep breath as you say you said breath. You didn't say deep breath. I took a deep breath.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that I've trained myself on, even if I say breath or you say breath, it's something I naturally do.
Yeah.
Because you notice, as you do it, you'll notice how often you're shallow breathing throughout the day.
Absolutely.
And not getting enough oxygen.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, it's one of those things I learned it, a friend talks about it this way, is like stealth meditation. Like nobody knows if you're paying attention to your breath. Nobody knows. Like right now, even like as you and I are talking, I could be
box counting right now. You don't
totally.
know.
Nobody knows, right? But you know what I will know is how present you are, how like attentive you are, right? If we're teammates working together over time, I'll notice like how much of the time you're locked in and how much of the time you're not, right? I'll notice the impacts of that. But I love this kind of idea of like it's just this kind of quiet thing that people are doing on their own. That's why a lot of times with mindfulness and meditation, people, talk about themselves like closet meditators. They're just doing it for themselves. There's people in every office that are going to be listening to this, that there's people that work that have 5, 10, 15-year meditation practices, but they just do it for themselves. It just helps them, right? There's an annoying phase in every meditator's life where they want to get on a mountaintop and like scream to everybody that they need to start meditating.
Oh, like everyone on a paleo diet or that does CrossFit or...
Totally. Like this is like a dynamic, right? Yeah. Like there's an old joke, like how do you know if somebody's a meditator? Just wait 5 minutes and they'll tell you. So I was committed to never do that, to never be that guy. Like I was just going to be Chad and have this show up and be a support for me, right? Yeah. Whatever that was, right? Professionally, personally, the things I was doing. And then my kind of first career was as a public school teacher. And after practicing for almost a decade, kind of my own personal practice and going on retreat and realizing this was going to be a huge support for my life, I felt like I was sitting on a gold mine. I was like, I got to find a way to share this with the kids that I'm with. My, colleagues who are stressed out all the time. And at the time, there weren't a lot of good resources for mindfulness and education. Now I think there's some pretty decent stuff out there. So I just got to pilot, right? Put things out there, see what happens. And that's kind of what started to get me hooked on this. Like, okay, like not only am I going to do it for myself, if nobody ever paid me or asked me anything about meditation for the rest of my life, I'd still practice.
Yeah.
I just happen to be very fortunate that it's turned into something that I'm able to do in a professional way.
It's matching a joy of yours with and being able to build a career out of it, which is I think, the best of both worlds. And I wish that for everyone.
Absolutely.
Right. So leadership has been, I found leadership being versus just being an advisor. In Northwestern, it's really cool because we have leadership on a horizontal spectrum instead of a vertical one, where most of corporate America is, climb the ladder. It's like, no, you can make just as much impact and make just as much money being an advisor as you can being in my position. And that's what I love about it. But I found more joy coming from leading others and pouring my life into others and seeing them succeed versus just building my own thing. Yeah. And there's not a right or wrong. Right. It's a personal preference. So we say that leadership is a preference, not a promotion.
Yeah.
And so, at least with us, I know in corporate America that is different. And if you go and get your MBA, you can get to this level and all that different stuff. So it's different everywhere, but that's what I've really appreciated about my journey, is that it was my preference based on where my joy was coming from.
I love that. And I love kind of like the, element of kind of, we're all unique individuals. And like what's going to make sense for one of us is going to be different than the person next to us. Even, colleagues in the same industry and profession, like how that shows up is different. Not to take it like too deep or heady or anything, but it reminds me of this quote from one of my favorite authors, Joseph Campbell. And what he says is, humans aren't looking for the meaning of life. What they're looking for is the experience of being alive. Yeah. So that their experiences on the physical level resonate with their innermost being. And so I think about that multiple times every day, right? And how does that show up, right? How does that show up for somebody who's in an identified leadership position, right? Maybe different. Like your resonance with doing that is going to be different than one of your peers. And there's no right, wrong, good or bad. It's just being able, and this is where kind of to tie back to what we were talking about before, self-awareness. Do we know like what makes sense for us? Or are we just kind of living out the momentum of the life we've been given? Right? Living out somebody else's life? Or have we identified, this is what makes me happy. This is what fires me up. This is how I like to grow. This is how I like to be in the world. And then we feed those fires. Yeah.
Like even the athletes you might be working, are you living out dad's dream, like on the football team, or are you living out your own?
Absolutely.
Right? Like finding that out is a huge thing, because if you're living out someone else's dream, you can get burnt out, you can get anxiety, you can get the stress that's undue. If you're living out your own dream and experiencing joy in it, then let's just figure out how to get you to center and succeed.
And this is one of the things that kind of like in the practices that we do, kind of some of these guided practices, and they can be short. We talk about base training practices and integrated practices. So base training practices, I talk about all of this work as strength conditioning for the mind. And it doesn't assume that anyone has any pathology or anything wrong with them. It just says we've all got a mind, we've all got a body, we've all got emotions. If we're not training for it, we're missing a huge opportunity to kind of advance towards our performance and well-being goals. So in this model, the base training is kind of like the time in the squat rack. Like you got to put in the time, right? Not to become a squat rack hero, but to have the, skills and capacities that'll transfer to performance. So those can be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. And in some of those practices, especially at the beginning, there's very much like a slowing down, right? There's a recognition, like we were talking about before, of like what's happening in my mind, what's happening in my body, which for many folks, they never do. In that retired NFL player training I was talking about earlier, it was week 3 of this training, and we did some mindful movement practice. And so the first practice is just standing and kind of aware of your posture when you're standing. And then there's like 6 or 7 more, moving the body in kind of different ways and aware of sensations as you're moving it. And then we finish the practice, we're checking in, and one of the guys, starts to check in, and you could just see it in him, like the emotion was coming up, right? And he said, I don't know the last time I just stood still. And you could really feel it in the room, right? And everybody in the room knew exactly what he was saying, right? And then we kind of moved on, right? The next guy said like what he had to say, about the practice. But it's rare in our culture that we give ourselves the opportunity to just be with our own minds and bodies for a little bit. And I think there's tremendous value to being able to do it, right? We can learn so much. There's unbelievable strength when we're able to do it. We start to identify the causes that lead us to perform at our best and those that don't, right? And then we start to once we've identified those, then we can train for them.
Yeah, that's so good. So like, I think about the Yin Yang symbol, right? And there's a few different schools of thought when you look at the Yin Yang symbol. The one that resonates the most for me is that everyone knows the Yin Yang symbol with a white with a little bit of black with a little bit of white. And the way I use it in a leadership sense is that in every strength, there's a corresponding weakness, and every weakness is a corresponding strength. So if you're restless, that person's restless, there's probably been a purpose for that restlessness, like that's driven them to success. But there's also that negative side that you discovered, or he discovered for himself in that moment of, hey, I don't know that it's okay to sit still.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a tough one.
It is a tough one. And I mean, honestly, Josh, this is one of the things that I think is like so interesting about this work and about being a human being is like the yin yang stuff. It's all a paradox. Like the human mind wants to make things like really simple and understandable, but like life is complex, right? So how do we like kind of find a sense of balance and okayness like in that complexity, right? And identify the things that are working for us and let go of the ones that aren't.
And being present enough to know what your body's feeling and doing, like he was, like you were able to get him into a spot to know. Like if you hadn't done that exercise, it may have taken years for him to realize that very thought.
Yeah.
Like I was working with my coach earlier this week, and one of my coaches, and he said something, and I was aware enough in the moment to go, the name you just brought up, my body had a visceral response to. My breath became shallow, and I could feel it right in my chest.
Yeah.
I was like, we need to work on that.
Well, and this is where like it gets really interesting, because I think for a lot of us, the body is just this thing that carries around our head, and we spend all of our time in our head, right? Like it's all just thinking all of the time. But the body has tremendous wisdom, right? The body knows a lot.
Yeah.
And are we paying attention to it to actually pick up on that, right? And like your example is a really great one, because like your body just had that visceral, reactivity to it, and you didn't figure it out in that moment, but it told you that there was something important there to pay attention to, right? There's kind of like that, I think about it sometimes as like the live wire of experience. Like that's what we want to tap into, right? Like that's where growth happens. That's where learning happens. Like that's where we go from good to great, great to elite, is like when we've tapped into that. And thoughts don't do that for us, right? Like it's the felt sense in the body that says this is where it is. And so that's one of the things we train for. I mean, scientifically, we call this interoception. It's just awareness of the body from the perspective of the body, right? It's feeling it, right? Athletes, when they're performing at their best, are they thinking about their performance? No. Right? Like
they're in the zone.
And they're in their bodies. Like they're in the zone. Like it's kind of going from there. Or even, in a business setting, in a professional setting, are we performing at our best when it's just like this cascading waterfall of thinking, or when we can like feel our body in the chair, right? Like feel the breath moving, and we still have access to all of the thoughts, right? Like it's not like we forget our training or forget all of our knowledge, right? But we have that space to be able to discern, is this the right thing to use now, the right tool to have? Is this the right response, for this client? But being rooted in the body is such a source of stability to be able to do that.
So speaking of the body, the gut brain, I don't know if you guys reference it that way, but I've heard another neuroscientist talk about that. Talk about a little bit about how the gut brain affects the head brain, the brain, the brain. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah. It's a really interesting area. I mean, admittedly, this isn't my area of expertise. It's something I'm really interested in, but in general, like we know that kind of like what's going on in the gut microbiome has tremendous impact over what's going on in our minds, right? In our psychological health. And this is an area of science that's like just kind of at the beginning stages. So we have to be really careful on what we know, but we do know that there's huge impact. So, kind of my orientation, I'm not a scientist. I sit next to the scientists, right? Is that we can be kind of the scientists in the laboratory of our own experience. So we pay attention. Well, what happens? I consume this sort of food in this way. This is the impact that it has in my mind and body. Is that a good one? Is that working out for me? Right? Or is it not? But again, to tie back to what we're talking about, that takes self-awareness. Yeah. Right? That takes an ability to notice what's going on in our own minds and bodies.
How do you feel energy-wise that day after consumption of this? Like, there's a reason when you drink too much the night before you're hungover, your body's having a visceral response to the poison, or maybe lack of a better term, that you put in your body.
Yeah. So we have to pay attention to kind of the interaction between the mind and the body, kind of like what's happening there. And, the gut-brain, axis is one of the really important, factors.
Yeah. But I just got on that feelings part, and I think, or you got on that feelings part, and I was like, that gut brain is part of it, like women's intuition, or you feel someone's presence walking into a room before you see them.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. That's not coming from up here. That's here, felt, totally. As you said.
And do we pay attention to that? Like, because sometimes that stuff is dead wrong, right? Like, just like sometimes our thoughts are dead wrong.
Yeah.
It's all just data. It's all just information, right? So if we can see it all and be aware of it, like, oh, like I'm having this kind of intuition right now that this is going to happen, right? Or I'm having this thought come through. Then we see it and then we can pay attention. Do I want to go with it or do I not want to go with it?
Yeah. So you work with people that came from all walks of life. I'm just thinking about, my experience on a football team. It is such a melting pot of experiences, of wealth, of racial divide, racial diversity, sometimes divide, but, so I'm just thinking about through all this, and you got to be so well versed to be able to handle all those different disparities. Maybe you could speak to that, but I was thinking about particularly last year with all the racial tension and stuff like that, and you, just like me, being a white male, and you got to talk and lead and help people of all races, religions, etc.
Yep.
How did you navigate those waters last year with being that you had to be looked to do this work and help them, knowing that tension's possibly at an all-time high, at least in our lifetime?
Absolutely. It's a really important question. So it's a question, honestly, that I hope to be asking myself for years and years and years, because I think it's such a fruitful question. But in terms of this past year, one of the things that I'll do when I'm kind of working with a new team off the bat is say, hey, I'm Chad, director of meditation training, give some of like those kind of, standard intros, connected to the Center for Healthy Minds, like all that sort of stuff. I'm also white, male, heterosexual, formally educated, and many other things. And all of that has impacted my experience and how I show up here today. I'm doing the work as best I can to understand systems of oppression and how things like racism are baked into our country, but I will make mistakes. And when I make those mistakes, I ask that you call me out on those mistakes. So I think part of it is just the naming of it, right? Like that all of these things are real things that impact all of us, right? And there's going to be a time where I'm not the right person to be leading, right? There's going to be time where it's going to be appropriate for somebody else, right? Like of a different background to be leading in different areas, but trying to just kind of create the space so that, issues of gender are things that we can be talking about that are kind of like on the table, that are, kind of appropriate for our conversation.
Have you ever gotten into a situation where like, oh, you wouldn't understand as you're trying to help in that arena, and how do you go through being able to navigate? Because obviously you do have an expertise. You don't understand how they grew up or their specific circumstances because you may not have lived them, but you do have an expertise on this side of things. How do you go about navigating those conversations?
I mean, if somebody tells me that, they're probably right.
Right.
Like,
yeah, there's truth in it, right?
And so kind of having the humility to recognize that, right? I think it's would be easy for somebody in a position of authority, as some recognized level of expertise, to think that they know what's going on. And they may have something that's helpful, but they may not. So I think showing up with a lot of humility is really, really important. And then maybe at some point it'll make sense. There'll be enough trust, there'll be enough relationship that, there is a space to kind of have a conversation. Because there is something that, and this is part of what I love about mindfulness and meditation is, we're training the mind. We're training to work with our body. We've all got a mind. We've all got a body, right? We all have emotions. We all have thoughts, right? Like we all experience so many common things. Yet the situations and the kind of circumstances in which it takes shape can be so broad and so diverse that I'd be foolish to think that I somehow have the answer for all of that, right? So it's kind of like where there's interest, great. Let's have a conversation and then kind of see where it goes from there.
Oh, that's good. And then, so we talked a lot about the university and the work there. How do you interact with companies, or how can you direct people that are sitting in a position like me to better help their, employees, contractors, all that different stuff?
Yeah, so there's a couple options. So if folks wanted to contact me, they can visit chadmcgehee.com. I wanted to create, a consulting company that allowed me to be able to connect with folks that are interested in training the mind for performance and well-being in many of the ways that we're talking about here. I sincerely think, like 50, 60 years ago, elite athletes weren't lifting weights. They thought it would make them bulky, heavy, wear their bodies out, right? And now that's completely changed, right? Like strength conditioning is a multi-billion-dollar industry with huge staffs of people.
I think anything about supplements, it's
massive, right? So if we think about what we're talking about today, if it's on something like a similar trajectory to that, well, we'll look back in 5, 10, 15 years, and this way of training the mind will be just as normal as training the body. I'm excited to be a part of that conversation. I'm excited to support folks. And given my experience in the scientific community and training in corporate groups and law enforcement and FBI and with athletes, I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities that'll come. So can check that out. Another group that folks may be interested in is Healthy Minds Innovations. And that is the nonprofit that's affiliated with the Center for Healthy Minds that I've mentioned a couple of times, this research group founded by Richie Davidson here on campus. And they're taking some of the tools of the neuroscience or some of the research from the neuroscience and turning it into tools. They have an app, Healthy Minds program. They offer various classes. So that's another kind of rigorous place to go. Because one of the things that can happen in this space is if you Google mindfulness or meditation, frankly, I think some of it's good and some of it's not that great, and not that I'm the one who gets to decide, but at least from, where I sit. So I think it's important to, send people in directions that they're likely to find high quality resources.
So speaking of that, that's really good. And I'm glad we'll have those in show notes, right, Chad? Awesome. So speaking of that, we're talking about a lot of proactive stuff to keep your mind healthy and to weather some of the storms that we've been through, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's a loss of a loved one, whatever it might be, or just your, 60,000 random thoughts that you have each day that are pre-programmed 90% from previous experience and thoughts. So when do you get to a point, or when does someone, or what would you advise someone gets to a point where they're like, okay, the proactive stuff's not working, this meditation stuff is, like, I'm still in a dark spot. How and when do you kind of advise, hey, this is where you might want to seek different type of treatment? Yeah,
it's a really important question. Like, meditation and mindfulness is not the answer to every problem. And so if listeners encounter somebody who is claiming kind of that mindfulness meditation can solve it all, I'd invite them to turn around and go out the door, because that person's just trying to sell you something that's not real. Because for all of us, there's going to be times in our life where we just need a little bit more support, right? Like that's just part of this deal of being a human being. So I think when it starts to kind of interfere with our day-to-day activities, right? If there's like some real struggle that's going on, and it's really starting to impact work in a big way or family stuff in a big way, then that's probably a sign that it's like, hey, like maybe it's time for me to reach out to somebody and get a little more support. One of the ways that we safeguard for that in the work we're doing at Wisconsin Athletics is I work really closely with the clinical sports psychologist in that department, because there's a lot of overlap between the two, but there's really important differences between them as well. So making sure folks know, my work is not clinical mental health. My work is taking, human beings that are, I don't see them like as having any pathology or anything wrong with them, right? And just working to have the skills to work with our own experience and kind of move it forward. So when the time comes where we need help, and I know I've needed that, and I'm sure we all have, that we make sure we reach out for that.
How do you get high performance type A driven athletes like that to ask for help?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Because I'm just saying, I'm thinking back to my younger self, and even my older stubborn self has struggled with this. I want to be as humble as possible in that. As a 21-year-old stubborn type A male, that would have been a hard thing for me to pick up that phone or ask for help.
I think one of the things that we've started to see happen a little bit with some of the work that we're doing is sometimes I think about, mindfulness and meditation training, especially some of like the early kind of intro level stuff, is really kind of humanity 101, right? Like this is part of being a human. Like there's no problem with feeling sad. There's not a problem like with feeling anger, right? Like these are just normal responses to being a human being. So there's a certain normalizing of that experience, or even like, we're talking about that behaviors, emotions, senses, and thoughts. Just acknowledging that you have emotions is radical in some environments, right? Like there's schools of thought that like see emotions as the problem, that we need to somehow like ignore emotions, right? Like that and that's just crazy town, right? Like I can't imagine, but like the detrimental impacts of showing up to the world in that way. So I think there's a certain kind of just getting comfortable with this is part of being a human being. And then, I think it takes people in positions of authority, in positions of power to model it, right? To say that, hey, I've had some struggles in my life and I've reached out, right? And I happen to be an extremely successful business person like yourself, right? So that people younger hear that and say, oh, like that guy's crushing it. Mm-hmm. And he's, struggle with some of these things, mm-hmm. right? Or you have, like I think about some of the examples with some of the former Wisconsin athletes, like Monte Ball. Like he's a profound example, right, of being able to perform at the absolute highest level and having some mental health issues that kind of really were problematic and struggled. And
now he's using that for good.
He's out kind of talking about his experiences. So I think, there's a certain kind of just normalizing that as part of the conversation. I mean, I think about, mental health, of course, has like such a stigma to it, right? And has such a stigma, especially like in traditional masculinity. But if somebody were to break their leg and not go to the doctor, it's insanity, mm-hmm. right? Like, but these like injuries that we can experience like mentally, emotionally, and psychologically may not be seen, but why would we not go get the support that is needed in those moments?
Right.
And then when we get that support, when we can actually kind of work through some of those challenging things, then it kind of opens the door to so much possibility. I mean, this, one of the things that I love talking about with athletes and in different groups is compassion. And even you or listeners, notice your reactivity when you hear that word compassion, like thoughts that come up, reactivity in your body. Because for a lot of folks, it can feel, syrupy, soft, like this weird vulnerability that just does not a place we want to go, right? But compassion at its root, like the Latin root of compassion, it's two parts, com and passion. The com is to be with, and the passion is suffering. So compassion at its root is the ability to be with suffering, to be with difficulty. And to me, that takes strength. Mm-hmm. That takes courage. Mm-hmm. That takes stability, right? So how do we show up for those things, right? And how do we show up for them when it's hard, when they're suffering externally, for the people we care about, for the environments that we're in? But how about for ourselves? Like, how do we have the ability to show up for the challenging things that are happening in our own minds and bodies? And when we do that, we give ourselves the opportunity not to be beaten down by it, but to understand it. And maybe even at a certain level, there's it's popular in psychology now to talk about post-traumatic growth. Like the learning and growth that comes from being able to face these things. There's an amazing metaphor that comes out of traditional Japanese culture where they have these, if they have like a very special vase, and it falls and the vase breaks. Then they gather all the pieces and they put the vase back together with like a gold laced, this gold laced material that kind of holds it back together.
And it's beautiful.
And then it is seen as an even more valuable, even more precious object, right? So what about that for ourselves, right? Like you and I and everybody listening has faced challenge in their life, and more of it's going to come. Like it's part of being a human being, right? But when those times, when we face real challenge, like the big ones, right? And we feel a little broken, what happens if we were to rebuild ourselves with wisdom, with insight, with this compassion, right? With this desire to, support ourselves and support people around us. Like those are the people that we encounter that are transformative, right? That aren't just living a life hanging out, right? But like the wake of people behind them is impacted in positive ways because of the work that they've done.
Man, that was so good. Hope everyone listens to that and goes back and listens to that, because just thinking about being with oneself, isn't that the hardest?
Absolutely.
Because you said you got to be with yourself, and like I was like, yeah, but that's the hardest. I didn't want to cut you off because you were on such a roll there. So I was like, that's the hardest piece.
It is unbelievably hard. My first meditation teacher put it this way: when you first start to meditate, it's like being locked in a telephone booth with a lunatic. And it's just all this chattering of our mind, like whatever that you're talking about, the number of thoughts. There's just so many things that are happening. And then when we start to give that a little space and realize that like, oh, that lunatic doesn't have to, drive the bus, right? Like I can actually kind of create a little space so I'm not listening to all of that. But, the mind is a dangerous place to go. So it's good to have help along the way, whether
absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, let's do the word game because we're over time and I want to be respectful of your time. So for the audience, if you haven't heard the word game before, I'm going to say a word and Chad's going to give his gut response, either one word or short phrase. And the only rule that we have is he can't repeat himself. Ready? Sycamore.
Hometown.
Learning.
Ongoing.
Teaching.
Fun.
Peace.
Always available.
Stress.
Normal.
Problems.
Expect them.
Solutions.
Creative.
Life.
A joy.
Death.
Normal.
Did you say normal already? Hey, you're supposed to be keeping track.
So I got another one. The next thing that came up, an opportunity.
All right. Yeah, I know you haven't said opportunity yet, so we're good with that. Good. Inspire.
Visceral.
That's one we haven't gotten before. Impact.
Do all the good that you can.
Good. Well, good job. I think that was, only if normal was used more than once, all good. But we got a different one for you, so that's perfect. So favorite podcast that you currently listen to? And then favorite book either of all time or one you most recently read you want to shout out?
Sure.
Not your own.
Podcast. Guilty pleasure podcast that I love is these Pardon My Take guys that have a hilarious take on sports. And one of the things that I love about them is they're just like kind of guys being dudes, which I just feel like I'm kind of like hanging out with my friends sort of thing. But they have a pretty irreverent approach to it. So kind of like, how can we enjoy sports without taking it too seriously? And I feel like it's a good metaphor for life. Like, how do we enjoy it, but not take it too seriously, right? Like, there's
break your TV because the team drafted someone you didn't want.
Right, exactly.
That's not healthy.
Or when you happen to be like a wise Chicago Bears fan and they draft Justin Fields, like you scream and yell and you love it.
That was we're very hopeful.
We are. Yeah. Hope springs eternal.
But, yeah. It's crazy. Favorite book of all time or one you most recently read you want to shout out?
The first one that comes up, I mentioned this author earlier, Joseph Campbell, he writes so many amazing things. He studied myth and
mythology, right? Yeah.
And mythology and kind of like the mythologies across like time and histories that kind of connect us across, different landscapes. So I would say anything by Joseph Campbell is.
Wasn't he consulted for the original Star Wars by George Lucas?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so once you read his work, you see it happening all throughout Star Wars. Like it's all there, right? It's all kind of these old elements of kind of like good and evil and the Force. And like these are all themes that have existed in every culture that every culture has just dealt with in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's fascinating. I have read some Joseph Campbell, and for those that are deep thinkers that have not dug into that, I would second that recommendation.
Yeah, great.
Very, very good. All right, so tell the audience about your upcoming event, The World We Make, and where to learn more, and how does the audience get in touch with you?
Sure. So The World We Make is an event that offered by Healthy Minds Innovations and the Center for Healthy Minds. And this is an opportunity for folks to kind of learn, what do we know scientifically about the ways to train the mind to flourish? What do we know scientifically about the ways to train the mind to deal with adversity? So check out centerforhealthyminds.org or healthymindsinnovations.org for that event, or lots of other events where they can deepen their understanding for their own well-being and their own performance.
Awesome. And you mentioned earlier your website. You want to say that again? We'll have it in notes as well.
Sure. It's my name, ChadMcGehee.com. McGehee. If anybody has a better business name for that, I'm open to that too, because McGehee's not easy to spell.
Well, it's like McGehee, Willis McGehee, but with all E's instead.
And a lot less speed.
Yeah, a lot less speed, I'm sure. He was good. So any parting thoughts? I mean, we covered so much. It was so good.
Yeah, I would just encourage, anybody who's listening, to, maybe pay attention to what resonated with you from the conversation. Not like what you think you should take from it. Not the thing that you're going to like try to convert into action tomorrow with your team or, at home. But the thing that just kind of woke up, right, that said, this is interesting. And the reason you know it's interesting is because you felt it in your chest, you felt it in your stomach, and just pay attention to that. Follow that live wire of experience, and kind of get out of your own way, let it unfold.
What I love about conversation and getting to know you, and so first of all, so glad you're on our team, Badger team, right? But first and foremost, and that you're the only one in the country that's full-time. Now, I know a lot of other universities bring in performance coaches
Sure.
and stuff of that nature, but this is such important work, and you're so authentically you. I know you connect with those students on a much different way than a paid consultant coming in, right?
Yeah.
So,
I appreciate you saying that. That means a lot. And it's one of those things, kind of like to go full circle, we're talking about kind of family of origin sort of stuff. And I think about what did I learn in the family, with being a McGehee, I think it was, work hard, care about other people, and have fun. So I just try to do that, right?
And if you do that, you should experience a great amount of joy in your life.
Yeah.
That's a great lesson.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I know everyone's going to get a lot out of this, so I love the parting words and find what most resonated with you. Where'd you feel it? Try and focus on that. Same as I, gave my personal experience. I had that visceral feeling. I gotta spend some time on that. So spend some time on where you felt that feeling. I love that. Well, everybody have a great week, and as you go about your week, inspire people and impact lives.